I'm just delighted you guys are all here, and I want to say I appreciate, too, the change of venue and all the chaos going on the Hill. I just think this is one of the most important topics we could discuss today, the two tasks. And Habib will get into it here in a second, but I'll just say from my own personal biography, I first encountered Charles Malik and his work as ambassador to the United States. This Lebanese intellectual, I first encountered it when I picked up this little pamphlet at Wheaton College when I was wrapping up my master's degree. It was just sitting on a shelf, unattended, and so I liberated it, and it just rocked my world, and it gave me a sense, yeah, this could be part of my calling. This could be part of my calling. I want to know more about him, so getting to know his son has been a great pleasure and privilege.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you. It's an important topic. In 1980, my late father gave this two tasks as a lecture at the Billy Graham Center in Wheaton College. And that same year, or maybe in 81, he published a book that he entitled A Christian Critique of the University. And essentially, both the lecture and the book focus on a very, very serious problem in the Western world, and that is the state of decline, if not decay, at universities, in particular when it comes to the humanities. And I don't think Charles Malik in his wildest dreams would have imagined that a few decades later, things would have become so bad the way they are today. I always like to say that until very recently, it was very clear that things like self-evident reality is not to be questioned. But you know, that's not just a function, if you will, of a prevailing Christian worldview. It was certainly that, but even in pre-Christian times, all the way back 2,400 years ago to Sophocles, for example, and his great play Antigone, it was crystal clear the difference between natural law and positive law. Natural law being something timeless, unchanging, and easily intuited by a living conscience, on the one hand, and positive law being the imperfect laws devised by men and regimes and states. And certainly biological reality was very clear up until 5 minutes ago, metaphorically. So the state of the university is what we're going to look at, and more specifically, the importance of cultivating the mind and not just the spirit. Because one thing that defines our dignity as human beings is the fact that we have been granted reason by the Creator. So 4 things give us dignity. An immortal soul, reason, conscience, and a free will. And these 4 define the human person. So reason should not be neglected, should not be, as my father says in the book at one point, he quotes, love God with all your soul and all your mind and all your being, which is biblical, of course. So that's why we're here today, and my friend Joe and I are going to have a conversation about some of these themes and issues, and we'll ask you all to chip in as well when the time comes. We'd like to hear from you as well, and let's have a general fleshing out of this important issue. Thank you.
And a question for George. George, if I put my microphone down, will that affect the recording at all? Because I'm Italian and I talk with my hands, and it's just hard. It's just hard to work with this little prop over here. And I'm told I really don't need amplification. And when people tell me that, it's usually not a compliment, just so you know. I wanted to read a few lines from the two tasks right at the outset that grabbed me. Remember, the context is he's giving this talk at the dedication of the Billy Graham Center in 1980. I speak to you as a Christian. Jesus Christ is my Lord and God and Savior and song day and night. I can live without food, without drink, without sleep, without air, but I cannot live without Jesus. Without him, I would have perished long ago. Without him and his church reconciling men to God, the world would have perished long ago. I live in and on the Bible for long hours every day. The Bible is the source of every good thought and impulse I have. In the Bible, God himself, the creator of everything from nothing, speaks to me and to the world directly about himself, about ourselves, and about his will for the course of events and for the consummation of history. Think about what he's saying. He is clearly identifying with this evangelical audience, the love of Christ, the personal relationship, the love of Scripture. And so this whole theme, the two tasks, he absolutely acknowledges the first great task is evangelism. Bringing the good news, the gospel of Christ, bringing it to the world. But the other task, as Habib has suggested, the other task is the life of the mind, cultivating the life of the mind. And let me read you a few more lines so you get a sense of his sense of urgency back in 1980 about where we are, his sense of urgency. What can the poor church, even at its best, do? What can evangelization, even at its most inspired, do? What can the poor family, even at its purest and noblest, do if the children spend between 15 and 20 years of their life, and indeed the most formative period of their life, in school and college in an atmosphere of formal denial of any relevance of God and spirit and soul and faith to the formation of their mind? The enormity of what is happening is beyond words. And that was in 1980. And so the disconnect between the existence of God, his purposes for our lives, a disconnect between that and higher education, as someone who's been in higher education for close to 15 years, the gap has just widened, it's deepened. It's a much more massive problem now than it was even in 1980. And so the challenge he gives to the evangelical, and I'll stop here and throw it back to Habib, the challenges he gives the evangelical, let's get a few more lines out here. He says the problem is not only to win souls, but to save minds. If you win the whole world and lose the mind of the world, you will soon discover you have not won the world. Indeed, it may turn out that you've actually lost the world.
Thank you. Yeah, I also have a quote that I want to read to you from the two tasks. Just a second, let me get it here. He says, I assure you that, so far as the university is concerned, I have no patience with piety alone. I want the most rigorous intellectual training. I want the perfection, I need to enlarge this a bit, I want the perfection of the mind equally. I have no patience with reason alone. I want the salvation of the soul. I want the fear of the Lord. I want at least neutrality with respect to the knowledge of Jesus Christ. We don't have that neutrality today at all. We have a sustained spirit of hostility in academia to anything Christian and to the person of Jesus himself. Now, why is Charles Malik feeling the urgency to give this particular message to an evangelical audience? Let me just say two things. First of all, he was a truly ecumenical person in his own constitution spiritually. He was Greek Orthodox to the very bone. He had learned the faith from his paternal grandmother, and he served in the village church over many years as a young altar boy. This is the Orthodox church in the village in Lebanon. At the same time, at a later age, he steeped himself in Catholic theology and philosophy, more specifically in Thomas Aquinas. And he was completely seized and captured by the great medieval synthesis of faith and reason that Aquinas and other scholastics at the time undertook. What is this synthesis? Well, it simply means an openness by the believing Christian to any truths that are lasting truths that have come to us, if you will, even from a pre-Christian era, say from Aristotle, or I just mentioned Sophocles' Antigone, which has an embedded timeless truth in it, which is the difference between natural law and positive law. So that openness, and hence the need to harmonize and synthesize wisdom from these traditions with Christian doctrine and Christian faith, was a great accomplishment, and Charles Malik appreciated that very much. And lastly, he was deeply endeared to the Protestant communities, including the evangelicals. Why? Because he was a person who was on a daily basis steeped in the Bible. And he lived in the Bible, literally. I mean, I always say that he was a bit of a polygamist. He was married to my mother, but he was also married to the King James Bible and to his little diary. And being a bit of a chronic insomniac, he would get up at night and pace back and forth, and then he's not going to wake up my mom. So what would he do? He would actually read the Bible or write in his diary. And growing up, he was someone who impressed me with his discipline. He would read literally on a daily basis 14 chapters of the Bible. Not 14 verses, but 14 chapters of the Bible in the Old and the New Testament. So after a period of time, he would cover the entire book and then read it again and again. And he loved the King James Version. He had his copy, which was deeply annotated with colors and underlinings with different colors and notes in the margin and so on. And then one day, he actually lost it in a taxi cab in New York City.
Naturally.
And he never recovered it back. And in a sense, it may have been, I mean, he was stoic about it. He felt that this was perhaps a sign from God saying, okay, enough attachment to the actual paper and the copy and the things you've written. The message is what counts. So, so having said that, he felt being deeply immersed in what he would refer to as the very rich and cumulative Christian tradition, that it is a shame that some aspects of this tradition are not as available or as readily sought by evangelicals as they should be. Yes. And that was really the reason for the urgency for delivering this kind of message.
Yes, thank you for that, Habib. There's a kind of a gravitas, I think, when I haven't seen him, a video recording of that speech, but you feel the gravitas of the moment. He's addressing this evangelical community. It's the Billy Graham Center. It's Wheaton College. I graduated from Wheaton, so, I'm a Wheatie. But what he worries about is this. He says, I must be frank with you. The greatest danger besetting American evangelical Christianity is the danger of anti-intellectualism. Mm-hmm. He says it to that crowd at that moment. And he, of course, wasn't the only voice raising that flag of concern. I'll just mention a couple others real quickly. Harry Blamires, who I believe studied under C.S. Lewis at Oxford, British guy, writes a book called The Christian Mind. Well, the opening pages of The Christian Mind, here's the opening line. There is no longer a Christian mind. That's the opening line to the book. There is no longer a Christian mind. What he meant by that is Christians are not engaging in the big questions of the day. They're not engaged in the universities. They can't compete in that intellectual realm. They haven't been thinking Christianly about all the major issues. The same message is delivered more or less in 1994 by Mark Knoll at Wheaton College there. I studied under Mark Knoll, actually history prof, The Scandal of the Evangelical Mind. And it's a very similar message. Let me read you a few lines from Mark Knoll. The scandal of the evangelical mind is that there is not much of an evangelical mind in 1993. And a few more lines from this. Oh boy, where do you go from here? He mentions Harry Blamires. Yeah, and he quotes from Blamires. I'll leave it at that. But I was in the audience when Mark Knoll actually delivered the talk that became the book. I was at Wheaton College when he delivered the lecture, The Scandal of the Evangelical Mind, to that evangelical audience. The auditorium was packed, hundreds of people, faculty and students. You could hear a pin drop. The same kind of gravitas about we're in danger here, friends. There's a huge danger of anti-intellectualism. And if that's so, we will not be effective witnesses for Christ in the places that matter. There are plenty of places that matter that we don't even see and pay attention to, but the universities matter, right? That is Malik's great message. The universities matter because they so affect the soul and the mind of a culture.
Exactly. And You know, the tendency is when you look at the utter collapse of the spirit and the utter warping of the mind in many of our great secular universities, the temptation is to give up and say, you know what, let's go off and make our own little world somewhere and have our own little university. And so that is not a bad idea, except that for Charles Malik, assaulting frontally the citadels of secular knowledge and the great universities should be the task of a Christian, of a committed Christian.
Yes.
And, you know, over the years, when I was at Harvard and then later, I was very heartened to see that something like the Veritas Forum has done precisely that, or tried to do precisely that, which is to assault these citadels head on.
Yes.
And they've had limited successes, but it's not a question of, you don't measure these things quantitatively.
Right.
If one person, if one soul was touched and managed to overcome some of the snares and traps of the secular university, then that would have made the whole enterprise worth it, I think.
Yes.
Again, let me just, I have some quotes here. I just want to read something from the two tasks. He says, Christ being the light of the world, his light must be brought to bear on the problem of the formation of the mind. The investigation will have to be accomplished with the utmost discretion and humility. I'll tell you what the investigation he talks about in a second. And it can only be carried out by men of prayer and faith. Once the light of Christ is shed on this study, incalculable will be the light the study itself will shed on all the problems facing the Western world. His main suggestion in the lecture, the two tasks, and then he amplifies a little further about it in the book, A Christian Critique of the University, is that this problem should be so important, it should seize people so much that some money and some thought should be devoted to actually studying very carefully the nature of the problem, the contours of it, and then devising methods of how to address it, how to face it, how to overcome it. And so that was his message. It's a dual message. First of all, the evangelical mind needs to be seized by the importance of the mind, but and the complementarity of faith and reason. And secondly, in order to conduct this frontal assault on secularism, we need to do our homework. We need to study the problem and devise a strategy to face it.
Yes. Let me respond briefly to that, Habib, and then maybe we can throw it open for Q&A.
Whatever you want.
Because we respect you guys' time, your schedules. From the two tasks. At the heart of all the problems facing Western civilization, the general nervousness and restlessness, the dearth of grace and beauty and quiet and peace of soul, the manifold blemishes and perversions of personal character, problems of the family and of social relations in general, problems of economics and politics, problems of the media, problems affecting the school itself and the church itself, problems in the international order. At the heart of the crisis in Western civilization lies the state of the mind and the spirit in the universities. That's his sense of urgency. And here's a man, that's why I so respect his life and career. Here's a man who threw himself into the breach as the Lebanese ambassador to the United States in the 1940s after the Second World War, deeply involved in the most important debates we were having as a global community, if I could use that phrase, hammering out the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and being at the center of that debate and trying to reinsert or insert into those documents, into the discussion, something like a biblical worldview. And I don't think there was anybody else, I could be wrong about this, Habib could challenge me on this, I don't know there was anyone else who had that depth, that Christian depth, intellectual, spiritual, moral depth at that moment in time. I think he was the man for the moment.
Certainly in the Human Rights Commission, that's true. But quickly, some there began to resonate with this, beginning with Eleanor Roosevelt herself. I mean, he presented a great defense of the human person, the individual human
Yes,
person,
yes.
in the face of Soviet attempts to
Yes.
dilute the importance of the person, to talk about collectives and abstractions and
Yes,
so forth.
yes.
And initially, it wasn't very clear to some of the others what's going on. See, one of the underappreciated features of Charles Malik is that at the United Nations at that time, in the 1946 to 1949, he was a spearhead of the ideological confrontation in the early Cold War.
Right.
And the next day, Mrs. Roosevelt came back, and she was the chairperson of the Human Rights Commission. And without her leadership, very little could have been done, and all of them, including my late father, acknowledged that. She came and said yesterday, Dr. Malik came under severe criticism and attack from the Soviet delegates, but I have to say that his inspiration was the American Declaration of Independence, the Constitution,
Yes.
and what he said resonates very deeply with us as Americans and with the Western world in general.
Yes.
And so she, in a sense, demarcated the lines of confrontation ideologically in the Cold War after his taking on the Soviets. He would take on the ideology of Marxism, Leninism, and dialectical materialism in speech after speech and demolish it systematically,
Yes.
while the Soviet delegates
Yes.
just sat there.
Yes, yes. Thank you for that, Habib. I suspect this is maybe another conversation for another day because I was somewhat critical of Eleanor Roosevelt in our last outing together. I think he stiffened her spine at the end of the day. That's Loconte's view on things. Could be wrong, but I think he stiffened her spine against the Soviets. So I think it's a good time to throw it open for questions here, ladies and gentlemen. Yes, and we've got a microphone here. Yeah. And so should we hand it out or let them come to it?
I would leave it standing.
Just leave it standing right there. Okay, just give them a little space they can talk. Okay.
But yeah, do make sure you come up to the microphone.
So the floor is open.
I have less of a question and more of a personal intervention or personal testimony. I was studying, I was doing a master's degree in history at the American University of Beirut when I came across the sort of the second volume of this, which is the Christian Critique of the University, sort of an expanded volume of this book. And in that book, I found answers to questions that were in my mind, suspicions about academia. My questions at the time were not even clear to me, but thanks to the longer version of the two tasks, the questions became clear to me and the answers were right there. And it was so important to me that I spent 10 plus years researching Charles Malik on a doctoral level, going through his diaries and papers. So I just wanted to say something. I mean, going back to what Habib said, that if this impacted at least one person, I can tell you there is a person, and that's me. I bet there are many others as well.
Yeah, that's
so
wonderful.
it's more
Thank you. Thank you
That's
very
wonderful.
much.
Thank you for that. Brilliant.
First of all, thank you both for being here. My question is, even though this he was writing and thinking about a generation before Vatican II, is it too much of a stretch to say that his writings, his thoughts, were the precursor to Vatican II?
What do you think?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. You're
Fascinating.
talking about the Second Vatican Council.
Yes.
You know, there's an untold story. Right here in Georgetown, there was a conference that took place in 1964, if I'm not mistaken, to which some major Catholic theologians were invited. Karl Rahner, John Courtney Murray, Hans Küng, and Charles Malik. And they discussed various matters, including human rights. And then in 1965, a very important encyclical was proclaimed by Pope Paul VI, which had John Courtney Murray as its author. And it's called Dignitatis Humanae. This is still unresearched, and I think a good research or doctoral candidate could work on this. Was there any thread that went into the making of Dignitatis Humanae, perhaps through this conference or through other avenues, from the Universal Declaration and maybe even through Charles Malik? So
Wow.
that's a very good question, but it's,
Wow.
it's a bit peripheral to our discussion here, but thank you for it.
Yeah, fascinating question, actually. And because I've read Charles Corday Murray, his book, We Hold These Truths.
Right.
And he was so instrumental in the Catholic Church's proclamation about freedom of conscience.
Yes.
Sounds like Charles Malik to me in some places, but anyway, that's a doctoral dissertation. Who'd like to take that on?
Well, again, to emphasize what you just said, Article 18 of the Universal Declaration is about freedom of conscience, and the wording of that article is Charles Malik's.
Yes.
It was, he proposed it, and there was no change in it, including the notion, the right to change one's religion. And that's a very important, it caused some issues with the Saudi delegation, but he and a friend of his from a very liberal Muslim from Pakistan, Zafrullah Khan, they went and lobbied the Saudi delegation and convinced them not to cast a negative vote, but to abstain.
Yeah.
Super interesting. Thank you both so much for your time. This has been such an interesting discussion. So I had more of a general question for both of you, and it's taking off a little bit from the point that was made about the Veritas Forum. I can definitely testify as somebody going through the difficulties of a secular education, that was, and coming from an evangelical tradition, the Veritas Forum was really, really influential in my life to know that there were people at the top of their fields that believed in the resurrection, that believed in a creation of some sort,
Right
and
there
that was
in Harvard Yard.
right, exactly. And going to places like Harvard and MIT and Caltech or whatever, and so that I could feel confident going into my little university, knowing that, okay, well, my big professor thinks that all this is nonsense, but somebody that's much more accomplished than they think that there's nothing wrong with this intellectually. So that was really, really influential.
Right. Yes.
So like one question was, to what extent, I realize that we can't really quantify it, but do you think that like the Veritas Forum and other initiatives like that are really putting a dent into the perception that to be a serious intellectual, you have to be materialist or atheist or at least agnostic? And then sort of another more specific question for you, Dr. Malik. We talked a little bit about the nature of the Western university, I guess. I'm curious to know, what's your analysis of the Arab university, and in particular, the Lebanese university scene, both vis-a-vis, some of the questions we've been discussing, but just generally, that trajectory.
Right.
I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts on that.
Right,
Thanks.
right. Shall I?
Jump in. Yeah, go right.
Okay. To your first point about the Veritas Forum or other initiatives of that sort to make a dent, again, I repeat what I said. To me, a dent is somebody being changed. But we obviously need much more in order to see any tangible impact on the university scene, on the secular university scene. Look, I believe it is not as formidable a task as it may sound. The secularists and their political offshoots, the leftists, they really don't have arguments. Believe me, they don't. I mean, I'll just give you a very quick example. I don't want to change the subject too much, but there are 3 instances in the history of the universe that remain inexplicable from an atheistic perspective. Where did the so-called singularity that banged, where did it come from? 1. 2, how did non-life transition to life? Again, you can play around, and this is what they do, with the definition of life and all of that, but then suddenly they become all of a sudden poetic, as if they were standing there, you see? So there's this lightning bolt that hit the primordial soup, and then the amino acids arrange themselves. It's interesting, it's fun, but it doesn't explain anything. And lastly, and this is the clincher, right? How did life become intelligent, conscious, and self-aware? Again, evolution won't explain the emergence of the human mind. In the span of time, which is 13.7 billion years, right? The human mind emerged in a flash, right? Homo sapiens are what, 200,000 years old? Let's go with Lucy, 2 million years old, all right? Hominids, right? What's 2 million in terms of 13.7 billion? So clearly, they have no argument, right? So if anybody is even moderately competent, these issues can be faced head on, I think. Now, to your question about Arab universities, Lebanon was a shining beacon for a long time in terms of higher education, also education on the lower levels, in terms of healthcare, in terms of banking. Much of that has been hit severely after 2019, when we had the general collapse. And today, education suffers in Lebanon. But in many respects, and certainly in particular disciplines, the universities are still holding their own. I mean, I have a daughter, a fourth-year medical student at the American University of Beirut. The instruction and the whole setup is very rigorous and very highly recognized abroad, especially in this country. So the sciences are more or less in good shape. But when it comes to the humanities, the same problem has filtered to the universities that we see in the West. Maybe in some respects less so, because in the East, family is still more together, family values, some attachment to religiosity is there, whether it's Christian or Muslim, for sure. And that obviously makes a difference. But we are on the receiving end of much that is coming out from here. And we'll see. The universities in Lebanon have had a tremendously positive and profound impact on the Arab world in general. There is a statistic that 19 of the representatives at the founding conference of the United Nations in 1945 were graduates of the American University of Beirut. That's interesting. Yeah.
Hello, thank you so much for being here. It's an honor. I have two questions to ask. When do you think this false dichotomy between the intellect world and the Christian faith occurred? And why do you think it happened? Specifically, when the Bible clearly encourages Christians to use their mind as a tool for evangelism. And my second question is, do you think there's a relation between this false dichotomy that is happening and the crisis in Lebanon? Thank you.
I'll go for the second one.
Okay, I'll take a quick step. Great question. Thank you for that. Great question. And different historians and intellectual historians and whatnot will have different takes on this. You can't place a year on it or a particular cultural event, but certainly with the scientific revolution, and you get in the 19th century with Darwin. Once we hit Darwinism, once we have the disconnect between belief in God, which is what helped launch the scientific revolution in the 15th and 16th centuries, right? A deep belief in an orderly universe because of an orderly, rational, purposeful God. That's how the scientific revolution started. But then it starts to get disconnected from faith. Once you get to Darwin, who seems to offer a quote-unquote scientific explanation for the development of life, if not the origin of life, the mindset that this next generation of scientists are having in the 19th century is the mindset is science can answer so many of our questions. Even if we don't have answers to the big questions now, the Big Bang, the origin of life, eventually science will provide those answers. And we can provide all those answers without religion. And religion seems to be contradicting the scientific answers, seems to be dug into its own citadel. And there are all kinds of things going on in both the Catholic and Protestant traditions in the United States that are drawing criticism and alienating them from the academy. All kinds of things going on. But the Darwinian revolution is hard to overstate how that began to undermine belief in God, a confidence that Christianity had explanatory power. Science seems to have all the explanatory power, not Christianity. So that's part of the answer. Just taking a stab at it. Go.
Yeah. What Joe is talking about is scientism. In other words, the worship of science, which is another way of saying man's own self-worship, because man does science, right? Look, I believe in evolution. I mean, it's not a conspiracy. Nobody came at night and placed these fossils there just to mislead us. But you see, what is evolution from a Christian perspective? It is only part of the how of creation. part of the how of creation. Evolution doesn't answer the three questions I just posed before. Where did the singularity come from? How did non-life become life? And how did life become conscious and self-aware and intelligent? Evolution can't answer that at all. So what is the answer here? It is the privileging due to a loving creator of hominids at a certain point, and the whole story of the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve and so on, the privileging of them with these important ingredients that define human dignity that I mentioned, the four: immortal soul, reason, conscience, and free will. Joe mentioned the Enlightenment and the modern period. He's absolutely right. I actually would like to date this whole thing to Voltaire's very glib and shallow response to Leibniz's provocative statement about this is the best of all possible worlds, Voltaire's Candide. That's when the modern world began. That's when the huge misunderstanding by secularism was launched.
Wow.
Yeah. Voltaire just made fun of the idea in a very shallow way that this is the best of all possible worlds. How can this be the best of all possible worlds? Are you an idiot? What kind of a deity would claim to be anything but a failed God if this is what he could produce?
Yes.
This is fine for humor, it's fine for theater. It is complete shallowness and glibness. Why? Because it just reveals that the secular mind does not understand the nature of evil and does not understand the importance of freedom.
Yes.
The true Christian anthropology, if I may, just one minute.
No.
The true Christian anthropology is the following. Number one, the creation in the image of God. Right? Number two, the abuse of freedom by the creature and hence the fall. So being created in the image of God means the creature, the rational creature, is free. And God respects that freedom. Had God decided to avoid evil by simply creating automatons, that would have been a less perfect creation, and he would have been a kind of an evil, diabolical kind of power, right? No, God took the risk of freedom. And then we come to the third part of the Christian anthropology. Once the fall took place, God finds a million ways in history to recapture fallen man for salvation. Culminating for, choice of a people, sending prophets and so on, culminating with finally, who is the best mediator and reconciler of a problem between God and man? God himself. There's nothing better than that. And so God himself comes down and is incarnated, crucified, and resurrected. And that is the Christian anthropology. The secular world has no inkling of it. Voltaire uses it to mock and satire. And guess what, everyone? Leibniz was right. If you understand freedom and if you understand the nature of evil, this is the best of all possible worlds.
I want to pick up that point about Christian anthropology and another stab at Reem's terrific question, because it's a big question. How did we get to this place? The evacuation of the academy, by and large, by thinking Christian people. The effective evacuation. One of the criticisms Mark Knoll makes in his book, Scandal of Evangelical Mind, no top-ranked research universities that are deeply and thoroughly Christian in the country, back in 94. And we haven't done much better since. It seems to me that even though the people who founded the colleges and universities in this country had this biblical narrative, that's how they thought, they founded those institutions of higher learning, over time they began to evacuate. Complex sociological reasons for that. I want to say at least one or two cheers for my evangelical friends, in that there's always been tremendous heart religion and energy and engagement at a social level in the history of evangelical Christianity in America, in the abolition movement, in taking care of the poor. Very active in civil society in that way. The energy in the evangelical world to address social problems has always been impressive to me. It's at the intellectual level where they began to pull away. And so the only result of that, if you evacuate the humanities, that the folks who are then communicating a worldview through literature, through philosophy, through the arts, through music, through politics, The worldview that you're getting reinversed constantly is a materialistic worldview. You're only going to get one result then of the students who graduate from those universities. You can't evacuate them. That's his passion. But again, the people who started the colleges and universities in this country, almost to a man or woman, had that worldview, right?
Right.
Al, you got a question?
I've got a lot of questions, but when I was going through graduate school, I attended the commencement ceremonies for graduation, and one of the speakers they had was Senator Paul Simon. Senator Simon was in college when his father died, and so he had to drop out to go run the family business.
Right.
And he never did graduate from college, but he went on to have a pretty illustrious political career. Very smart guy, and his message that day was summed up in being a politician, he can speak in sound bites. So his sound bite was, "Don't let your diploma become an intellectual death certificate." I thought that was, this is a guy who never graduated from college, but clearly he did not have an intellectual death certificate, whether he graduated or not.
Right.
My question is in part, what did your father surround himself with besides his Bible, besides his Aquinas, that really developed his intellectual depth? He's a professor of philosophy, and
Right.
I don't know how much time he spent teaching at universities. He was in the diplomatic corps, but what did he surround himself with in that regard? And then, why is it that evangelicals in particular tend to focus on him as a hero of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights when there were other Christians who were part of that committee?
Okay, I haven't forgotten your Lebanon angle. We'll get to that. It's a good question. Of course, my father was reading many other things in addition to the Bible and Aquinas. I'll just give you an example. On the table at the time of his death, there were 3 books sitting there that he was reading continuously the several weeks and months before he passed away. The Bible, but also a copy of Dichtung und Wahrheit by Goethe, which is Poetry and Truth. And then he also had a book of perhaps the most famous Arab poet, Al-Mutanabbi, with his poetry next to his bed as well. So it shows you that his interests were quite multivaried, and to choose to read Goethe and Al-Mutanabbi in addition to the Bible just before you're about to pass away is an interesting statement. I mean, one has to ponder it even more deeply. But look, he's the one. Thankfully, I grew up in the era before the internet. So we spent our summers actually reading books. And he's the one who directed me and many of my close friends to Dostoevsky, for example. And that was a life-changing, revelation for me, Dostoevsky's writings and works. So he's obviously steeped in the Russian literary tradition as well. So we can go on and on, but and clearly you mentioned teaching philosophy. He's the first person who set up the first philosophy department in an Arab university back in the early 1940s and late 1930s, only to have the hiatus of about 15 years of a diplomatic career, which he reluctantly went into. He wanted to be a professor. And then in 1960, he returned back to teaching. And so he was very immersed in Plato and Aristotle, gave courses on these great thinkers. Those were his main, if you like, loves. He was very much into the modern existentialists, Pascal, Kierkegaard, Dostoevsky, Nietzsche, Heidegger. He studied under Heidegger briefly in the 1930s. So, I mean, we can go on and on about that. Just repeat and what was the second question? You had 2 questions.
Oh, your other question was about why is Charles Malik held in such high regard and known, and other Christians there in that seminal event at the UN and the Declaration, why are they not so well known, yeah?
Why do evangelicals not gravitate toward them in any way? Why
I think because it's a combination of how articulate he was and how bold he was in actually presenting a viewpoint that was, in many respects, Christian but also universal. See, this is the beauty of it. It's the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and it is truly universal because some of the timeless assertions it makes are found across cultures and across space and time, and they happen to be also Christian. So in that regard, I think he was the more outspoken of most of the delegates there.
Yeah.
Yes, my second question was, since you stated this false dichotomy between the intellectual world and the Christian faith, the crisis that is happening here in the West, do you think there's a correlation between that divide and the crisis that is happening in Lebanon, especially with the Christian representation?
I think what's happening in Lebanon has its own set of parameters that are predominant, political, religious, and so on. I don't think faith and reason is that much of an issue there. Faith is very important, and in some, if you like, circles, it's a mirror image of the banishing of reason in favor of faith, in some respects, in some quarters there. But that is less of an issue, and people tend to be far more preoccupied with the general political, economic, and social collapse, and also all of the other dangers surrounding the country regionally and internationally and so on, than that particular one. And lastly, all of the associated problems that the West faces today with regard to some of the culture war features are hardly registering in a place like Lebanon. Yeah.
We're at about 1:05 time-wise. What's our cutoff time?
120.
About 1:20, so we got time for a few more questions. Another quick thought here, kind of in response to some of these other questions. Can these efforts to speak into the culture, whether it's the Veritas Forum or other efforts, can they be effective, and are they important? I think they are. They're part of the answer. We've got to train up young men and women, though, to be in the academy, to be those professors who are bringing a Christian worldview to bear in their discipline, in the humanities in particular. But I do want to mention this. One of the great gifts to the Western world, it seems to me, in terms of a Christian thinker, in addition to Charles Malik, is C.S. Lewis. And one of the things that Lewis did at Oxford in the late 1930s and 40s, when the Second World War is on, a young female Oxford student was complaining to her mentor that no one was really addressing the skeptics and the atheists, that no Christian was really answering them, this young Christian lady. And her mentor said, well, let's have a meeting about this and have a discussion about it. Let's invite some students to come and have a discussion about it. They did. It was a busy, packed room. And then they thought, we need to organize this. Let's go to C.S. Lewis and see if he'll help us out. And sure enough, what happened was the birth of the Socratic Club. C.S. Lewis led the Socratic Club. It was a weekly debate between not just C.S. Lewis, though he often was the key speaker, Lewis, but the best Christian thinkers in the Oxford community and the best atheists or materialists would come and debate. They did it every week, I think for about 13 years. Lewis led the Oxford Socratic right through the Second World War. Now think about that. Why did C.S. Lewis believe it was essential in the midst of this existential crisis that Great Britain is going through, that the West is going through, Nazism? It's still important to address the life of the mind. And those rooms, those Socratic Club, you read some of the reflections people had on those, the place was packed out, standing room only. And the lives that were influenced, we'll only know the influence of that when we pass through the veil.
Right.
And see the young lives who are just transformed by that debate, seeing thoughtful Christians engage with the best agnostics of the day. So it's absolutely useful and important to do.
Wasn't that the period when he also wrote and published the Screwtape Letters?
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
Screwtape Letters is right, 1940, 41, 42.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
After hearing a broadcast of Adolf Hitler
Yes.
on the BBC, simultaneously broadcast into English,
Right.
2 days later he's in church and thinks, the devil. The devil.
Right.
So important to engage the brain in season and out of season.
That's right,
Even
absolutely.
even in midst of the crisis.
Very much so, yes.
And it seems that's what your father was doing.
Yeah.
He's engaging the brain in this international crisis coming out of the Second World War. You cannot overstate the sense of, I think, probably gloom and dread and potential cynicism, having discovered what went on in the Holocaust. And that discovery is being made in 1945, 46 with the Nuremberg trials. So it's so fresh, the sense of
Very
what
much so.
humanity could do to itself.
Right.
It's so fresh, and the tendency toward nihilism must have been so great.
You know, there's an unpublished manuscript by Charles Malik, which he entitled The Race. We hope to publish it one day. And it's taken from a statement by St. Paul, of course, that I ran the race and I won the race and so on. What is this race? It's the race between the devil and Christ for souls.
Yes.
And this unpublished manuscript is a series of very biblically grounded and theological reflections and aphorisms, which we hope to publish one day.
Brilliant. Would love to see that. We've got time for a couple of more questions. So, wilting wallflowers, it's time to bloom out there.
Excuse me, this is a little bit kind of off topic, but something that jumped out at me just thinking about when you're talking about the secularization of universities, the banishment of God in general, and is the fact that, and you said something to the effect of, you know, there's this push to make our own institutions, and that's not necessarily wrong, but it doesn't fix the problem, which I agree with. I think sort of a side issue in terms of intellectual life, something I've seen kind of creep up recently, is not even so much, you know, Hillsdale College or whatever, some of these other institutions, but sort of the freelance public intellectual that's kind of a quasi-religious figure. I mean, the most obvious example is somebody like Jordan Peterson, but you could also cite various people that are more explicitly religious, some of the Christian nationalist types. There's others I could think of if I thought about
Yes.
it. I guess my question is, to what degree do you think that is a reaction to what's going on in the universities, and how much of it is a positive or negative influence? I mean, I realize it's kind of a big question, because you could say that, well, this guy's okay, this one not so much, but big picture, what do you think of this phenomenon and how it affects all the things you're talking about?
Great question.
Very good question. Yeah, there are some very fascinating and influential public intellectuals who, in fact, adhere in one way or another to a broad, if you like, Judeo-Christian position. Jordan Peterson is certainly moving in that direction quite quickly, and he's being literally persecuted for it, starting with Canada and other things. I think now he's found a good home for himself with the Daily Wire, but we'll see. Another one that comes to mind is George Weigel, who is in ethics and public policy, and in his case, he's reacting more to some of the decay in the church itself. So I read George a lot, and I know him personally. He's a good friend. There are many like that, and the more we encourage and we seek out wisdom from people like that, I think the better it'll be for the culture. Now, you know, the idea of going off and doing your own thing on the side, that's the ideal of the city on the hill that is at the founding of America, which is great. But America didn't just remain a city on the hill. It became eventually a beacon for the world. And so American history has wavered between bouts of isolationism and then also a very well-articulated message to the rest of the world. That's what we seem to have lost of late. I mean, I'm just thinking of the great 19th century missionaries who set up some of the greatest universities in the Middle East. And they've gone, you know, the way of all universities, which is the secular way. But they certainly gave the best picture of the good American. Later on, what the message coming out of the West in general and America is to the rest of the world is much more impoverished and much more, in a sense, self-damning, because it's not revealing the best of the best that is found here.
Yes. And maybe a quick thought as well about that question, the role of public intellectuals. America has always had them. They've played an important role. And especially now, you could argue that their role is even more important and urgent because we're so awash in lies. We're so awash in partisanship, nonsense talk, the lowest common denominator, who's got the loudest, craziest voice, who's got the microphone, et cetera, et cetera. And so serious, thoughtful people can get a hearing. Jordan Peterson is obviously one of them. But also, I've been watching what's been happening with Barry Weiss, who left the New York Times as a columnist.
Yeah.
Who's a person left of center in terms of most of her views from where I am. But she was fed up with the conformity and the cancel culture at the New York Times.
Absolutely.
And she started basically her own news organization.
Yeah.
She just held a massive debate in Los Angeles. What was it, 1,700 people crammed? Were you there? Yeah. Well, then you can tell us about it. 1,700 people cram into a theater to hear a debate about feminism in Los Angeles.
The sexual revolution.
Has it failed us, the sexual revolution? So the fact that all these people are willing to go to a public debate on this contentious question, I wasn't there, so you can tell us if it was a civil debate. But she certainly said she was aiming for a civil debate. And that kind of response tells me there is a hunger for that. Public intellectuals engage in a real conversation. We should not allow the craziest, looniest voices to dominate the narrative all the time. We need a little more courage, don't we? A little more courage.
Absolutely, yeah.
Others, yes.
So I want to take another stab at asking questions. I told you I had many. You mentioned the Universal Declaration, Article 18, has the right to change religion.
That's right.
And your father was adamant that he wasn't going to change the wording, and he would rather that the Saudis didn't come on board than that he capitulate to the idea of universal. In the in the ICCPR, it uses the word choose, not change. It changed that word from change to choose, and it was in part because of some of the Muslim majority countries. They didn't like the idea that you could change your religion. Once you have chosen your religion, that's it. You don't get to change. And so, in a sense, by the West allowing that change, adopting that wording, they've sort of capitulated and given up on the idea of the life of the mind. I mean, it's a signal. And I'm wondering if you can give some insights into what was going on there.
Yeah, look, change, choose, we can get into a semantic game here, but that's not the point. I'm sure that's not your point. I think change is more basic than choose. Why? Because, and I'll tell you why, where Charles Malik is coming from with this idea of change. If you remove this phrase from Article 18, it's still by implication there that you can change your religion, by implication. But he felt you need to actually spell it out. And choosing is more like, almost like a cafeteria, supermarket kind of situation where here are the things on offer and I'll choose what I... Most people come to the supermarket or to the cafeteria from something already there. So they may wish to change what is already there, not just choose. I mean, I said there's semantics here, but I think change is the more philosophically fundamental and powerful term. Yes. Now, the other thing is Charles Malik was, by his own open admission, out to seek the truth, no matter how challenging that is. And he believed truth exists. And if a person at some point realizes that for whatever reason they are not in the truth, they need to have the right to change where they are towards the truth. The other thing is, Charles Malik comes from the Middle East, and he knows very well that the notion of apostasy in Islam and the idea that this should be punishable by death because it has to be a fixed part of your very being if you're born as a Muslim. This is a violation of human rights. You have to be, as a Muslim, able to turn your back on Islam. Just as you, as a Christian, you have to be able to turn your back on Christ. This is the whole point. Evil, again, we go back to what we said earlier. Evil is not something in and of itself. It's like black. Black is not a color. It's the absence of the spectrum, right? So what is evil? Evil is the turning away from God, usually towards some version of self. And then all the pride and stubbornness associated with that. That's evil, the turning away. Augustine has it very clearly in the City of God. So if that's the case, then recognizing that you're in the wrong and turning away from the wrong in the other direction, instead of turning away from God, turning towards God or the truth, ought to be a very fundamental right that anyone should possess.
Yes.
I think that's it.
Yes, and a very quick follow to that, if I could, because our time is short. Anybody who knows me, any Loconte event, we've got to bring in some John Locke at some point. Let's bring him in right now. On this point of choice and change, this is Locke's, one of his great insights in his letter concerning toleration,
Right.
which is, I think, the most important transformational document defending religious liberty in the West. I'm sure Malik read it, understood it, studied
Very
it.
much so.
The American Revolution is a Lockean revolution. And,
Yes.
But the point here I want to make is Locke was operating out of, I think, a deeply biblical understanding of the world. So at a moment of great debate in the West, in Europe in the 17th century, you have a Christian thinker like Locke speaking into that moment
Right.
and producing this seminal document,
Right.
which has so affected the American experiment and the West more broadly, right?
Except that we have to also keep in mind the exceptions that Locke had to toleration. There's a list.
Well, I would say there was one big exception, the atheists. We can debate whether or not
The Catholics.
I don't think he did actually have a bias against Catholics in a way
Okay.
my Catholic friends say, but that's
Right.
another debate for another day. All right.
Fine. But he was John Locke was certainly a transformative moment, and exactly as Joe was saying. Absolutely.
Great. You want to have a closing remark here, my friend, on this?
Thank you for coming. I mean, I hope this was useful or meaningful. We didn't waste your time, but we tried to, in a sense, show, put the spotlight on a speech that Charles Malik gave in 1980 at Wheaton College to an evangelical audience, pretty much to alert them to the importance of the life of the mind.
Yes.
And I think since then, and Joe knows this has reverberated very positively in evangelical circles.
Yes.
Francis Schaeffer, an important evangelical theologian, was very much on board with the idea of my father. Carl Henry, another evangelical theologian, the same thing.
Yes.
And then the works cited, one written before and one written after the Wheaton speech, are all in the same direction. So I think there's something there.
Yes, prophetic voice. We need the spirit of Malik, a reinvigoration of the spirit of Malik,
Right.
it seems to me.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, one more thing before everyone leaves. We have these books, which are very hard to come by these days if you're curious more about Charles Malik and human rights, that our friend Tony has. And then if you're interested in reading more Malik, we have our digital archive, the first ever, where you can access things for free online, speeches, writings from Charles Malik, previously only in the Library of Congress. So we have templates in the back if you want access to the archive and all of that. And thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.